We are having here Randy Hanson from USGS California, water unit, I mean. And yesterday you used to retweet one of the David Rizzo tweet about the discussion we had afternoon. And Randy is a lead hydrologist in USGS since 35 years. He has a bachelor in mathematics, geology, and a master of science in hydrology. Right? Am I right? Yes. Right? He's working a lot on modeling stuff, and he's leading the development of Monflow, which is a water hydrologic model. Within using modeling stuff, he's working on conjunctive use of sustainable surface and groundwater, and with him and the goal of targeting issues like climate change, agricultural water use, and as far as he told us in the 5 days we have been together, he has been dealing with much more than only this. So it's time to leave you the stage, and thank you again for being here.
Thank you all for having a late afternoon with me. Appreciate it. Rudy asked me just so apologize for the short notice on this talk. We just decided yesterday to do this. I've been giving this particular talk or variations of it for a few years. One of my other research topics is climate change and climate variability. And so I look at regional flow systems. We develop new methods to analyze and describe and simulate regional flow systems. And then we also are looking at climate change and climate variability and seeing how they are also affecting the hydrosphere and various components of the hydrosphere that are affecting both nature and the anthropogenic forces that are caused by humanity. This is a talk I just actually gave in Reno, Nevada, just last month. We have a gathering of the USGS every 4 years of all the groundwater people, and so we just had that gathering in Reno, and I gave several workshops on one water and our we have a climate toolkit. So actually, if you're interested in climate variability stuff, we have a really cool toolkit. It's almost like a video game, so it's really easy to use, and you can do spectral analysis, EOFs, empirical orthogonal functions, all kinds of other stuff, very easily on the fly with all kinds of data sets, both 1D temporal or spatial temporal data sets, shape files, all kinds of stuff. So if you're interested in any of that, let me know. But this was a talk that I gave. I thought I'd get up on the bloody pulpit and be provocative about climate change. And really, again, I've been giving this talk for quite a while because climate change, believe it or not, in many parts of the world, is still not accepted. And so what I love to do is to go to those kind of audiences and tell them, I don't care whether you believe in climate change or not, I'm going to show you a little bit about climate variability, and we want to be the furry little mammals and survive the climate variability as well as the climate change. The two together are problematic. On top of that, the human stresses, it's really the 1-2 punch. So really you have climate change and climate variability, and then you have the stress of increased demands from humanity. And that's really what is probably going to be our biggest challenge. And so this is a tale of two drivers, climate variability versus climate change. And really what I want to go through here today is I want to look at the climate change and variability background. I want to show you a little bit about how it works, at least in our hemisphere, so it could be different where you are, I'm sure it is. Some climate issues and states of the science, then I'm going to look at some tools and selected analysis. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples. Actually, because I have a little bit more time here, I threw in another example. But we'll look at Mexico, Central Valley, and Opera Valley, which is in Monterey Bay, the central part of California. So we'll look at two California examples, and we'll look at Mexico Valley. And everybody's really worried about sustainability and conjunctive use, but it's really going to be adaptation and mitigation, not so much mitigation of climate change, but mitigation in the way we live and interact with the hydrosphere that's going to allow us to survive and perhaps have some quality of life and an environment around us. So I want to step back a little bit and really say that this one man's climate cycle, another person's climate change. This may be part of what we're seeing, and it's pretty clear that we are seeing climate change. But if you go back a million years, what we really see with these are the glacial cycles going on here, that we really see some very strong cycles for the recent cycles. The last 4 cycles have been 4 to 8 cycles, and then we get some weaker cycles. So even the cycles, the glacial cycles themselves are processing from strong to weak cycles in this context. But the way we view climate variability are these quasi-periodic, interannual, interdecadal changes in climate versus climate change, which may be larger cycles or monotonic steps changes in climate that potentially are anthropogenic. So then you step back to the last 100,000 years, and what we see is the onset of stable climate, which is really the onset of agriculture. That we really had. This is using oxygen temperatures as a surrogate for climate. You can see how unstable the ice age was here and whatnot. So we're really in a nice zone right now as far as climate and temperature goes and whatnot. And whereas we had, previously we had variabilities that were 4 times more than what we're really experiencing right now in the last 100,000 years. Versus the last 12,000. Now let's look at the last couple hundred years. And this is reconstruction. This is cumulative departure precip reconstructed for an area just north of Los Angeles, California. And then these little blue bars on here are the various El Nino events that have occurred. And really what we start to see is that we've had quite a bit of variability even at this smaller time frame since 1450 in this region. Here's some wet and dry periods that we were simulating in that area with a hydrologic model. So it's really not always clear what is really driving these wet and dry periods, and it's clearly not El Nino by itself. In fact, El Nino is a minor player in a lot of what we do, even though a lot of people still claim it's the major driver. What we end up doing is looking at a variety of climate cycles that affect our part of the world, and they include the Atlantic Meridional Oscillation, Pacific Decadal Oscillation, a combination of things that are monsoonal flow, the Pineapple Express, we sometimes call it, that comes off the Pacific. If you've ever seen the global maps, it's like a hose. And then actually what the Pineapple Express is what's called an atmospheric river. And if you're familiar with that term, it's a fairly recent term that's been used quite a bit. But atmospheric rivers are amazing because over 90% of the transfer of water from the mid-latitudes from the equatorial latitudes to the mid-latitudes occurs through these atmospheric rivers. And so they're really intense events. They're fairly broad. They can be 400 kilometers across. They can be very narrow. They kill people. They can be very dramatic as far as their events. And we're actually studying them. We're flying planes into them now, measuring them with various instruments and whatnot to try to understand them better, but they can be very dramatic. And so anyway, these are important events. Monsoonal flow for us is stuff that comes up from Mexico across our southern border. And so we get a monsoonal flow this way, and then the Pineapple Express is coming this way. The PDO is coming down from the north. And then El Nino, of course, is warm sea surface temperatures that are allowing Pacific hurricanes and other things to process more northerly as opposed to northwesterly. So we have these different climate cycles that are really collectively coming in and out of phase with each other, and that's what's really generating these larger cycles here. So just a side note, as you can see here, what these different cycles look like, the indices for that. So the El Nino cycle is by definition, is the barometric pressure difference between Darwin and Tahiti. The PDO is a actual sea surface temperature difference in the Bering Sea, the northern Pacific. The AMO is a similar type of index in the northern Atlantic. So we're actually controlled by all these different things that are in both oceans. But if you get a chance, just a footnote here, this is a great book here. The great warming. Brian Fagan is an anthropologist from the University of California, Berkeley. And he looks at the rise and fall of civilizations subject to climate variability all across the world, from Genghis Khan to the Polynesians discovered in the South Pacific Islands, the Peruvians, the Mayans, everyone. And he really, the last 10,000 years, it's a great book. and it's really well documented with scientific footnotes and whatnot as far as looking at how climate variability has really affected a lot of civilizations in spite of their efforts to survive. So again, forgive me for not being able to describe more fully what's going on in your world, but in our world, we have this kind of either what they call zonal flow, and then meridional flow, where it kind of comes up and down like this. And so really, La Nina is where we have this high pressure is blocking here. And when we have La Ninas, we know it's going to be a dry year for us. So it really does affect, regardless of what's going on with PDO and other things. When we have El Nino, there's only really a 50-50 chance, based on historical analysis of the El Ninos, as to whether it really will be a wet year or not. Because it really has to be in phase with some of these other cycles that are also forcing us upon. What I have here in this lower graph is a set of tree ring indices from Arizona. And one is from on top of a volcano, the bristlecone pine, and the other is from a set of ponderosa pines that are further down the valley. And if you know central Arizona at all, Mount Humphreys, which is right near Flagstaff, Arizona, is a tall stratovolcano. And then you come down off the Mogollon Rim, and there's a canyon that comes down off there, which is where Sedona, Arizona is, and this is near there. We had a lot of indigenous people that lived prior to Columbus discovering America, and many of them were wiped out by some of these climate cycles where we had multi-decade or century-long droughts and whatnot. And so what I'm showing you here is this was really the decline and relocation of the Anasazi, which were in the Four Corners area of New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, Colorado, where those states come together. It wiped out almost all the Indians in California. Their main foodstuff was acorns from oak trees. That was their mash that they made, and oak trees are not very drought resistant, so almost all the oak trees died, and they almost all died, whatnot. So a lot of these pre-Columbian civilizations, which were really very elaborate, I mean, they had huge cities and whatnot. Some of them even had wells and very elaborate civilizations like the Aztecs and Mayans. They all got wiped out or had to relocate down to where there was closer to water, and that was really based on this multi-decadal, century-long drought here. And similarly, what was interesting is that I was visiting one of and that was really during what we call the medieval warm period, which is 900 to 1300 AD. And then finally, this particular tribe here, the Sinagos, which were also pre-Columbian, they survived because I think they had a lot of base flow that were coming off the Mogollon Rim. So they had stream flow, even though there was drought for quite a while, but they didn't survive the second one. And so, we have pulses of these multi-decadal droughts that are typical and have occurred in the past. What's interesting is that the more recent part of this tree ring index is off the charts compared to these multi-decadal droughts that we've seen in the past. The Little Ice Age is another component of what was going on. So we really see both wet and dry and warm and cold cycles in all of this. And again, these are the periods that they discovered from looking at these tree rings here, 14, 18 years, the PDO and type cycles. What we've seen in California is that we see a lot of the same thing. Again, the mega drought on 910 to 1100 AD was really, again, when all these civilizations were almost wiped out or had to relocate. And then finally the medieval drought that followed it, 1210 to 1350, right here. So this is just looking at a reconstruction of events in the Sacramento River, the Sacramento Delta, and these are some really long dry periods that, people had to try to survive. So is one person's climate change another person's climate variability? I would probably say no. There are natural and anthropogenic components and competing drivers, especially in today's society with urbanization. We've all seen this diagram, so I won't belabor it. I think it's pretty obvious that we have an additional component that's probably going on that really includes greenhouse emissions that are really required to get this kind of the famous hockey stick increase in temperatures. The other thing that's worth looking at is how volatile water supplies are in California. So just kind of comparing those watersheds in California here versus the Columbia River watershed here. and the Great Basin, they really act differently. So these different watersheds are like concert halls. They vibrate and resonate to different frequencies and periodicities of these climate cycles differently. So they can respond or store more water and respond to these different sets of these frequencies quite differently. And what we end up seeing is that the Sierra drainage generates about 31.8 cubic kilometers of runoff. That's a fifth of that in the Columbia, but it's 2 times that in the Colorado. So I mean, they're really quite different. And the Sierra drainage is about a quarter of the area of the Columbia or the Colorado. So we see really different behavior, both the climate and whatnot. And then finally, the reservoir storage in California is about 49 cubic kilometers. It's equivalent to about a 1-year supply. So we don't have a lot of headroom in this climate variability game. So when we have a 3, 4, 5-year drought, it becomes pretty serious pretty quickly because we don't have a lot of extra freeboard in the system, capacitance to survive these kind of variabilities and whatnot. They also vibrate at considerable different coefficients of variation too. That was worth noting here. And so then one of the things that we've already seen is earlier spring flows in the last couple of decades. And so we're really seeing some work that our Stewart did here when she was at Scripps Institute of Oceanography. And what we really see is that we're starting to see, looking at kind of the centroid of runoffs, of snowmelt runoffs every year, that we're starting to see quite a bit sooner runoffs. And then this is just showing how many days earlier it's occurring in various rivers. They've looked at a variety of rivers in these mountains all across the west and all the way to Canada and Alaska. And we can see that it's really becoming pretty apparent that we're seeing runoff quite a bit sooner with climate change. Even under the coolest these scenarios, we're really looking at an increase in temperature. And really minimum temperature is the thing that's going to probably be the biggest effect in my mind. A lot of people are worried about sea level rise, which in many places that will be a dramatic effect if you live near an island or in a coastal area, some of those shallow coastal areas. But really, it's the minimum temperature that's really going to drive a lot of the changes that are going to affect us. So you're going to have earlier snow melt, increased flood risks, lower base flows, limited diversions, warmer streams, drier summer soils and fuels, increased fire danger, increased irrigation, potentially large changes in mountain recharge with timing, higher ET and higher minimum temperatures. So you're not actually going to be able to grow certain crops in some areas. Other areas you're going to be able to grow them then. So I mean, it's not all bad. Certainly longer growing seasons. We're already seeing that, for example, in some areas they're getting extra cuttings of alfalfa and whatnot. So it's already, we're already seeing some of the effects of that. They can go a little bit longer. We also see downward trends in the April 1st snow water equivalent. So they actually measure the snowpack and the density of the snow to see how much equivalent water it has in it. And the amount of water actually in the snow is also decreasing. So that's not so good. So earlier runoff, the runoff has less water content from the snow and whatnot. We're seeing that already in a lot of these areas and being able to simulate with the big problem here as well. So also estimating the influences of these ensembles. The expected fraction of annual precip of these mean temperatures is also decreasing quite a bit in these areas. So as you get into these later decades, we're really seeing less rainfall that's affected in some of these areas. So that's also a huge problem. I'm going to show you an example of that. So if you go back to Versmarty's article in Science in 2010, he makes a pretty nice case that the relative change in demand per discharge just from climate change only is up here. So this is really the ratio of discharge that's available to a base amount of discharge. And so, blue is good because the baseline is greater than the increased demand. Red is bad. And so you can see that with climate change, we do get some areas where with climate change, the demand for discharge, runoff and whatnot, is going to exceed the baseline amount. When you end up adding in population change, that's a huge stressor. And you put the two together, and it's not a pretty picture. So really, rising water demand really outweighs the effects of greenhouse warming, climate change through 2025 at least, based on his analysis, and there really is a direct human impact on global water supply that's really poorly articulated, and really is probably going to be as big an issue as climate change itself. The other thing that's worth noting is that there's localized effects as well. We see that we have urban climate now with urban heat islands. It's occurring air pollution. Actually, they're also now identifying that these large agricultural areas are creating extra ET, that are creating extra rain in adjacent areas. So it's crazy the teleconnections that we're starting to get and additional localized effects that are occurring in some of these other areas. It's also possibly with climate hazards, vulnerabilities, and adaptive capacity and sustainability, we're going to really start to have to worry more about governance and management and managed resources, whether we're going ag to urban, the water-energy nexus, formal versus informal supplies are going to have to be looked at a lot more carefully because there's going to probably be a lot more shortages. And in California, we use about 20% of our energy is used just to move water around. So really, if that gets much higher, it's really going to be an issue. I want to look at a little bit at this toolkit that I told you about, and it's called the Hydroclimate Toolkit, and I want to just kind of do a little bit of climate variability analysis and show you some examples of where we've done that, and then I'm going to look at some examples of where we've actually looked at some productive use and how that plays into supply and demand. So I already showed you this figure here, and what's interesting is when you break this down, and this guy Freeman did this really nicely documented, and we see even in the midst of dry periods, we still see these blue events or flooding events. So even during pronounced dry periods, we still have some flooding events that are occurring, as well as some severe dry events. So we really have these multiple cycles playing against each other into these larger wet and dry periods that are occurring in that. And so the idea is, how can you tease all that out of a signature like that? And we have this Hydroclimate Toolkit. It was developed by Jesse Dickinson, one of my colleagues in the USGS in Tucson, Arizona. He took a lot of the methods that I developed along with a guy named Mike Dettinger, who was part of this as a PhD at UCLA, and then went on to develop more of it at Scripps Institute of Oceanography. So we did a bunch of climate studies and slowly but surely developed these methods, but they were onerous, they were difficult to go through all the steps. And so I tip my hat to Jesse because he put together this really nice C-sharp GUI that allows us to analyze these kind of data sets and analyze them not only individually but in the ensembles and look at correlations. We can also do projections into the future and so on, and I'll show you an example of that. So you can actually decompose them into the components, the various cycles, and look at them individually or reconstruct suites of components of the variability and project it into the future, and so on. But let's look at some analysis that we've been able to do with these. And so I'm just skipping to the end. I'm going to show you actually how to use the toolkit. If you're interested in any of that, let me know, and I can certainly send you the class that we give on a workshop. But this is climate variability composite of interannual to interdecadal cycles for some Southern California rivers. And what we can see is that with these rivers here, the Santa Ana, Santa Clara, the Sespe, you don't know these, but this actually is the last wild river in Southern California. Coming out of the Potomac Mountains, where they actually are trying to rehabitat the big condor birds in that area. But we see, we see a little bit of insults. So this is percent variance in the stream flow record. We can see here that we get some monsoonal effect. We get quite a bit of PDO effect and a little bit of AMO or larger effects beyond PDO. So we can see that we get quite a bit of the big driver for these rivers are these 10 to 30 year cycles in these rivers. The other thing that's of note in that area is the effect it has on these wet and dry periods has on pumpage. And this is kind of an unusual area. They've been actually measuring pumpage, metered pumpage of all the wells, agricultural and municipal, for decades. And this is just looking at what the basin total pumpage is in acre feet. Forgive me for the English units. That's a lot of water. And what we really see is that when you look at wetter springs versus drier springs, that they're having about a 20% increase in pumpage, largely driven by earlier planting and pre-wetting of the fields for irrigation of the truck crops and whatnot. So it's a huge jump in demand just by going from a wet to a dry period. So we not only have variation in supply, but a variation in demand, both occurring. Okay, so that's the point of this. So in this particular example, again, this area again is just north of Los Angeles. Los Angeles is right in this area here. That we see about 65% of the variance in historical precip is really explained by just 10 of these reconstructed components of the variability. So we can do it by doing spectral analysis here, which is largely the PDO, the ENSO, and the North American Monsoon Pineapple Express. We also looked at how to maybe project these into the future, and here are some projections. So we actually do projections using the reconstructed components in an ARMA model, and these are some actual measured precepts. And the other question is, you may wonder, why are we doing everything in cumulative departure? For two reasons. One, it instills serial correlation in the record, and it aligns things like precip and tree rings and stream flow with groundwater hydrographs. And groundwater hydrographs, a time series of groundwater level, are actual cumulative departure curves. They're cumulative departure curves of change in storage, of groundwater storage. So we wanted to align them with them, and also embed serial correlation. So that's why we do that. But you can see here that we're actually able with the ARMA model to predict in the near future fairly well what the precip was going to be for years just coming out of the past. Again, in this area, this is the Santa Clara Valley, this is Silicon Valley, so that's South San Francisco Bay Area. Again, this is looking at a much wider variety of examples. I have stream flows, I have 2 rainfall stations, and I have a bunch of groundwater wells and a set of tree rings from nearby set of mountains. And we again can see that we have very similar clustering, and also all the parts that are affected by the hydrosphere are seeing these same cycles, and then we see and are dancing to the same tune, basically, including tree rings here that are. And this is typical of the PDO that we'll see several. We'll see it's like a 12 to 15-year cycle in here, and then a larger harmonic of it over here. So this is again pretty common for what we see. And I show this to water managers, and I say, you might not want to make your planning horizons arbitrary. You might want to align them with these climate cycles, and whether it be policy, non-structural management, whether a policy governance, or whether it's structural projects. You're planning to do something 20 years into the future. For us, it's always a lawsuit. So it takes about 20, 30 years for any kind of build a canal or a dam or whatever, or anything like that. So you really need to be kind of looking at these cycles to be able to capture wetness and prepare for dryness. This is what those reconstructed cycles look like for the long-term groundwater record in this region in South San Francisco Bay. And again, you can see the big player. The black is the supply and normalized residuals, and then these are the reconstructed components. So the biggest piece, again, is the PDO piece. The red is the biggest component in the groundwater levels as well. And really what we saw in this area is, again, that going back to that theme, is a combination of these climate cycles, and then on top of that, increased human stress. And so what we have here, again, is that same water level record coming and going in a cumulative departure, that's the water levels. And then this is the great drought of the Dust Bowl right here. And then we also had other droughts here and here. We started inducing land subsidence, so that was affecting the area. And they had to start bringing in imported water right in this period here to stop the land subsidence. So again, that's a conjunctive use issue. And as well as population just going out of control, which it still is in this area. So you really have both stressors going on. You have these long cycles of climate. On top of it, superimposed on it are these large increases in population. They're creating secondary effects. So let's look at a couple of examples. Let's start down south in the Valley of Mexico. And these are just showing some pictures of what it looked like back in the days of the Aztecs in the, basically Cortez is discovering the island in the center of the, what was then a volcanic lake in a closed basin. And this is 20 million people now. And we're working on this area. We're modeling Mexico Valley. It's sinking. Land subsidence is one of the issues. That is a huge issue there. And it's such a problem that they're actually having to move one of the largest airports in the world to a different part of the valley. And so you can really see there's some issues that affect everybody. And so they're going to move it from over here to over into this region here. We did some climate analysis there because one of the things that actually happened since the 1900s is that there used to be all these volcanic springs surrounded by volcanic mountains. And the volcanic springs supply a lot of water for the valley in New Mexico, and they all dried up. And everybody goes, oh yeah, well it was because we put a gazillion people in the valley. Well, that certainly was a big stressor in the area. But we went back and actually looked at the climate variability and the climate record in the area. And again, we see that PDO, even though this is a more equatorial latitude, it still has a big driver of the PDO cycle with these same kind of periodicities. We get some Pacific hurricane because the hurricanes from the Pacific start right off the East Pacific coast there, just south of Acapulco, and then they come up and more times they even blow across the volcanic mountains to Mexico City, that area. So we do get some of that, and also El Nino. And so what we end up doing is that we want to include some climate variability in the model we were doing there. And we're starting out simple. We don't have the farm process or anything else going on in this area yet, even though there is quite a bit of ag still in the urban area. But we noticed that based on this, there's about a 9.5% increase over average precip for wet years and about 15% less precip for dry years. So that's a pretty good bump. That's about a 20% bump between wet and dry years. In California, it's more like a factor of 2. So, but that is still a significant bump. And what we were able to do is use the climate toolkit then with that precip record and project into the future realizations of future climate that we could use. They wanted to simulate out to 2050, which is about here. And so, I didn't have that record, so I was able to manipulate the recharge arrays and some of the other elements of input to the model by using these projections of precip to simply categorize them as wet or dry in these areas. And what we can see here is that this is a hydrologic budget of the model. You can see that here's the springs drying up. Here's pumpage climbing out. This pumpage here. So that just increases the pumpage. So really, what happened is that they not only were increasing population, but they had a prolonged dry period in the area. So it's really, again, the 1-2 punch. They had a really long dry period and increased unbridled urban growth all at once. Well, let's jump to the Central Valley real quick. And what we're seeing here, again, is wet and dry periods. And the Central Valley is really built on an infrastructure, dams, reservoirs, canals, and so on, to deliver snow melt. And they built all that back in the 1950s because it is the tale of the western United States. They would go from initially using surface water until they exceed the resources, and then they start pumping groundwater, and then they start having bad effects. The bad effects in the Central Valley were land subsidence. And so if you look at the delivery or the extraction of water between the period of about the 1920s through the mid-1960s, a third of the groundwater that was extracted was from land subsidence. And that's a one-shot deal. It can never be replaced, never recovered, never replenished, and whatnot. So they had to stop that. So they started bringing in additional surface water and creating this elaborate surface water network and reservoirs. And so what we now see is this kind of pattern here where this line here is the surface water deliveries, and the dark blue is pumpage. So you can see in wet years that we're predominantly delivering surface water. In dry years, the pumpage becomes the main player, and back and forth and back and forth. And this is what we're seeing with wet and dry years here. Whereas the total farm delivery requirement does oscillate with wet and dry periods, but is not necessarily going crazy. So what we did is we hooked the Central Valley hydrological model, which used the farm process, to some GCMs and looked at what would happen under the A2 scenario, business as usual CO2 emissions. And so part of the challenge is actually going from a very coarse grid like this, which you can actually see I've blown it up in this area. You can see how coarse the GCM gridding is over an area like California, down to a small area like that. So we do a lot of downscaling, bias correcting, and so on, and then actually running a precipitation runoff model for all these watersheds that you see here off the side, and then an integrated hydrologic model in the middle, and they all are delivering runoff at these little red dots. The green dots are diversions, so we're actually delivering water to various parts of the valley. Let's just take a quick look at what's going on. And again, we get into the situation where this is again cumulative departure precip. Everything is oscillating along even into the future, and until you get to about 2053 with the A2 scenario. And this is just one possibility. I'm not preaching this is what's really going to happen, but it just turns out that in the A2 scenario for this part of the world, things go to hell in about 2053, and we start to have these decadal droughts, and it's not pretty. And what we see is that max temperature does rise some, but the big bad boy in the room is minimum temperature. And so for some of the crops that they're growing, for example, almonds, they supply 40% of the almonds for the world in the Central Valley, and almond trees require about 200 hours of chilling temperatures, below freezing temperatures, to fruit. Well, that ain't going to happen pretty soon. And in fact, in some areas like Lodi, which is just south of San Francisco Bay, we're in the Central Valley, in this region here, they're already moving the Pinot Noir grapes out of that area and replanting the grapes that can withstand these warmer temperatures. So they're already adapting to climate in some of these areas. So, with respect to projections in the future, what we end up seeing is a discharge reduction of about 20 to 65%. So it's an enormous. So we're taking the snow and rain that we're getting from the GCM, and we're running it through the BCM model, the basic characteristics model, the form of a rainfall runoff model for all these watersheds, and then predicting what the runoff would be from each of them. And
in fact, we use another one here.
Oh wait, it was this one. That's right. I had that wrong yesterday. Sorry about that. So what's also interesting is the Sierras are higher in the south than they are in the north. Even though these are the larger watersheds, Mount Shasta and Oroville, but you can't just assume that because they're further north, they're better off. They certainly weren't. And we definitely see a large reduction, especially in the later decades. So the way we did this is that we start with the downscale climate climatology, and then we run the GCM information through the basic characteristics model, which gives us a runoff for these things. And then we create runoff that we can then communicate in here, and then also predict what the diversions are going to be and whatnot. And then we use the downscale precip and potentially ET directly with the farm process in the valley itself. We leave everything else alone. So we're not going to change land use. We're not going to look at ag to urban. We assume a modest amount of increase in urban growth at 1.2% increase in water demand per year. That was a projection from an independent source. And actually, that's a fairly large increase in urban water demand. If you actually start to increase that even more, the secondary effects like land subsidence become really, really large. So what happens with that? So here we are in the past. This line is demarcation in the past and future, and this is groundwater pumpage in orange, and then it turns into the blue line, and this purple line is surface water supply. So these are the two sources of water for irrigation, and this is the total farm delivery requirement. And so we see as ET increases with the minimum temperatures increasing and whatnot, then we get an increase in total farm delivery requirement. At the same time, we're getting less runoff, so we have less surface water to deliver, and we start dropping off in surface water supplies and have to supplement more and more with groundwater supplies. And so what we've basically done is totally transitioned this system from a predominantly surface water delivery-based system to a groundwater delivery system. And there's no free lunch on that. That's not sustainable. And it's only going to cause secondary effects, and we're already seeing them. So one of the secondary effects that we looked at, which is a biggie in this part of the world, is land subsidence. And so this is historic land subsidence. It's largely in the south and largely along the western side here. Well, not these are the large areas of land subsidence. And one of the other issues with the land subsidence is differential land subsidence. And they built all these major canals that now deliver water from the north, where the snow was, to the south, where they're doing a lot of the agriculture. Although they zag in the whole valley, they also export water to Southern California as well. And so you don't want land subsidence, you also don't want differential land subsidence because it starts to break up the canals, disrupt the grades, and crack the canals and so on. And so what we saw when we simulated the future here, we're starting to see land subsidence over on the eastern side of the valley. And I go, oh my God, is that real? So then I called up Michelle Sneech, who's one of our scientists that works a lot with remote sensing and INSAR and land subsidence and whatnot. And sure enough, we're already seeing land subsidence on the eastern side of the Central Valley. It's already happening. We're already back because of the drought we're in right now, we're already back at lower water levels. So we're seeing already the onset of renewed land subsidence in a lot of these areas, just from climate variability, the drought we're in. But what we're projecting here is that there would even be additional land subsidence and more of it on the eastern side, as well as renewed land subsidence where the infrastructure like canals is occurring. So that's not a good thing. I'll wrap it up here to talk a little bit about Prospero Valley. This is a billion-dollar ag industry here, mainly strawberries, vegetable row crops, things like that. In Monterey Bay, this is Monterey Bay. Right here, this is the Monterey Submarine Canyon, which is larger than the Grand Canyon, but it's underwater. And so we have issues with seawater protrusion because of the short circuit along the Submarine Canyon. We have overexploitation of groundwater. It's the only source of water. The San Andreas Fault goes right along the edge of the back of the basin here along the foot of the Santa Cruz Mountains, so you can't build a dam. You can't have a reservoir with a major fault like that going on. So it's really a game of inches trying to live within their means. So they tried some different issues here. So I want to look at this is going to be more about climate variability. They're trying to get people off coastal pumping to shaded areas where the seawater intrusion is. They built this pipeline. They're trying to get people to stop pumping from these wells. And they're using recycled water. They have an ASR system going on. So we model all that in our using One Water. And we deliver it to some of these subregions. So the dots are the wells that are going to go away or stop being used. And in these colored regions here, there's the ASR and the recycling facility right here and whatnot. So they're able to deliver about 7,600 acre feet, which doesn't mean anything in cubic meters. It's about a third to under a half of how much they're overexploiting, their overdraft, how much relative to annual average recharge. So they need to get additional projects going. But we wanted to see how these projects were affecting things and whether they were actually helping. This is how we actually simulate the system. So we're actually capturing runoff. We're putting in an ASR system here and then pumping it back down. We're capturing a little bit of city well field into the back of the basin. We're using recycled water. We're delivering it to these four regions that I showed you in this previous slide. So that's this region here, 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 and here are all getting recycled water and ASR water and so on. And we actually are able to simulate that historically fairly well. Here's looking at the comparison between supply and demand through the years, with more targets of demand and more sources of supply. And we're actually able to do that for these 7 years here fairly well. And so it's pretty much a supply and demand. So we projected it in the future, say, well, how are we doing with just these projects? Are we able to actually survive climate variability? We projected it backwards all the way back to the drought. We had a severe drought in 1976-77. So we projected that into the future, and this black dashed line on each of these is the equivalent freshwater head. So that's the head that they have to be above to not allow seawater intrusion, basically. And so what we're seeing is that in some of these wells that are near the coast, that the purple is the future, the red and the blue are the measured and simulated in the past, that we actually do a pretty good job of getting back towards that, but not all the time. And in some of these areas, we're close. And some of the time we even exceed it, but not maybe during the droughts, as you can see here. So, the projects are helping, but they're not enough. And they certainly are not enough during the dry period. So they're going to need some additional projects to get a little further down the road and be able to survive the droughts as well. And that's why they're looking at manage that for recharge. They actually have a very innovative program here where they're going to, they have an augmentation fee, which is not a pump tax, but it's just like a pump tax. And they are going to give people credits if they can prove that they're capturing local runoff and recharging it back into the aquifer. And so they're not going to reduce their augmentation fees for use. It's a separate item and an incentive for them to actually locally recapture, recharge, and help with recharge. So that's a big program going on there right now. We're hopefully going to be able to model that as part of our next phase. But I have to tell you that even in this context, there's no free lunch. And so what we're looking at here is a histogram of coastal flows. And these are outflows below the zero, and these are inflows. So these are basically surveys for seawater intrusion. The different colors of the bars are the different pieces of the different aquifer layers or offshore outcrops where that water might be coming in from. So some of the aquifer is actually outcrop along Southern Canyon, some are actually out on the seafloor, and so on. And what we see is they had quite a bit of inflow, but even in some areas, for some of the layers, there was still outflow going on. So we typically have water going both directions at the same time in many of these coastal aquifers in different parts of them, as you can see here. Into the future, what we see is that, in fact, they're able to reduce this by about half. That's the good news. The bad news is that the strongest boundary condition for the recovery in that area is still the ocean. And so what's driving the recovery is still going to be more seawater intrusion. And unfortunately, they still have a city at the back of the basin that's creating a regional cone of depression that is driving regional gradients that need to be mitigated as well. So that there's still larger problems that need to be mitigated in the context of the regional scale. And then just a good example that there really is no free lunch in the sense that you can reduce inflows, but you may still have the seawater, the ocean, driving the recovery in those areas. So, enough from me. I did want to summarize with a few take-home messages, and one is the one I always preach, and that is this is really one water. And if you're looking at conjunctive use and the secondary effects, you really need to be able to simulate a coupled approach to one water, and we're trying to do that with the one water hydrologic code. The linked integrated models and observation networks are really needed, combined with this physically based resource analysis. And that's really where we're headed with the developments that we're doing. Sustainability, conjunctive use, and adaptation are controlled by these secondary effects, especially under forces of climate and humanity. And again, management horizons may range from years to decades, more than a century perhaps. Possibly doing climate projections to 2100 may be inadequate. Certainly at this point they may well be. So in California they were looking at a time frame of 2050, and that's absolutely ridiculous because that's not even part of a PDO cycle, much less see climate change. And we're looking at sea level rises of a meter or so. That's over a century. It's really going to be the inundations and the other extreme events that are going to occur. That are coastal inundations that's going to occur from storm events and large neap and king tides that are really going to probably be more of a hazard in the variability context, even from the ocean standpoint. There are multiple stressors. Climate change, urbanization, agriculture, and environment are all stressing these systems in ways that have to be reconciled. And climate variability is going to be embedded in climate change and maybe the more immediate threat to water food security with more and larger extreme events within these climate cycles. So.